I didn't ruin my life. I paused it. And I stayed that way for so long that one day I forgot what I was waiting for. People assume regret comes from bad decisions. From mistakes you can point at. From moments you wish you could undo. Mine didn't come from doing the wrong thing. It came from doing nothing over and over while convincing myself I was being patient. I told myself I was waiting for the right time. For clarity. For confidence. For some invisible signal that would tell me, now you can start. That signal never came. Life just kept moving. I remember the moment the thought first appeared, quiet and almost polite. You're not living yet. I dismissed it immediately. Everyone feels like that sometimes, I told myself. Everyone waits. Everyone prepares. Everyone puts things off. That's what responsible people do. So I kept preparing. I gathered qualifications I never used. Built safety nets I never jumped from. Made plans that existed only on paper. From the outside, I looked disciplined. Careful. Strategic. Inside, I felt suspended. Like my real life was standing just behind me, hands on my shoulders, waiting for me to step forward. But I didn't. Days turned into routines. Routines turned into years. Each year felt like a continuation rather than a beginning. I wasn't unhappy. That's what made it dangerous. I was comfortable enough to stay still. I woke up, completed tasks, went to sleep. I met expectations. I avoided risks. I told myself that stability was a victory. And maybe it was for a while. But stability without movement slowly becomes a cage you decorate so you don't notice the bars. I started noticing the signs in small, unsettling ways. I stopped feeling urgency. Stopped feeling excitement. Stopped feeling fear. Everything felt delayed. As if my emotions were buffering. Friends talked about milestones with energy, decisions made, risks taken, lives changed. I listened carefully, nodded thoughtfully, and felt nothing but distance. Not jealousy. Distance. Like I was watching life from a waiting room. I convinced myself that I was simply cautious. That not everyone needed to rush. That starting later was wiser. But late nights told a different story. In silence, I felt an unease that had no clear shape. A sense that time was passing through me without leaving a mark. I asked myself what I was building toward. The answer was vague. Security. Readiness. Someday. Someday became my favorite word. Someday I'd try. Someday I'd choose. Someday I'd begin. Someday allowed me to postpone everything without admitting I was afraid. Because the truth was simple and uncomfortable, I wasn't waiting for the right moment. I was avoiding the possibility of regret. Ironically, that avoidance created it. I feared choosing the wrong life so much that I chose none at all. I told myself that inaction was neutral. Inaction is a decision that compounds quietly. Every year I didn't move made the next year harder to start, every postponed choice increased the weight of the first step. I felt that weight in my body. A heaviness that had nothing to do with fatigue. A pressure behind my thoughts, like something unfinished pressing for attention. I ignored it. I told myself I had time. Time felt infinite until it didn't. One evening, sitting alone, I tried to remember the last time I felt truly present. Not busy. Not occupied. Present. The memory didn't come easily. That scared me. Because presence doesn't disappear overnight. It fades when you're always preparing for a future you never enter. I realized then that my life hadn't stalled because of circumstances. It stalled because I kept my foot hovering over the brake, afraid to press the accelerator. Afraid of speed. Afraid of mistakes. Afraid of choosing wrong and having no one to blame but myself. So I waited. And life, indifferent to my hesitation, kept going. That was when I finally understood something that no one warns you about: living on pause feels safe until you realize the world doesn't pause with you. And by the time you notice, you've already missed more than you're comfortable admitting. I didn't know yet how to start. But I knew with absolute clarity that staying paused was no longer harmless. It was costing me my life quietly, politely, one unchosen day at a time. After that realization, I didn't suddenly become brave. I became restless. There's a difference. Bravery pushes you forward. Restlessness keeps you awake. I tried to return to my old rhythm, but something had shifted. The routines that once felt neutral now felt heavy. Every repeated action reminded me that I was still waiting and that waiting was no longer innocent. I noticed how often I delayed decisions that required commitment. Not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because choosing would end the comfort of possibility. Possibility is seductive. As long as you don't choose, every future remains intact. Every version of yourself stays alive in theory. The moment you act, most of them die. I wasn't afraid of failure. I was afraid of closing doors. So I kept them all half open, even as time pushed them shut on its own. People around me didn't see hesitation. They saw patience, thoughtfulness, care. I learned how to frame my inaction as wisdom. I'm taking my time. I'm being careful. I don't want to rush into the wrong thing. Those sentences protected me from scrutiny. They also protected me from movement. At night, my thoughts became more insistent. Not loud, relentless. They circled the same question from different angles. What if this is all there is? Because I never decide otherwise, I started to feel resentment toward time itself. Not because it was passing, but because it refused to wait for me. Days ended whether I used them or not. Years added up without asking if I felt ready. I realized how much of my identity depended on preparation. Being almost ready had become my comfort zone. It allowed me to feel responsible without being exposed. Exposure was the real threat. Choosing means being seen. Choosing means owning consequences. Choosing means you can no longer say, I might have been something else. That terrified me. I had built a life around minimizing regret. Ironically, that life was full of it, just quieter, harder to name. I began to notice how numb I felt during moments that should have mattered. Birthdays passed. Milestones arrived. Opportunities knocked politely and left when I didn't answer. Each time, I told myself it wasn't the right moment. The truth was simpler. I didn't trust myself to live with the outcome. I asked myself what I was actually protecting. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't success. It was my self-image as someone who hadn't failed yet. As long as I stayed on pause, I could imagine that I was capable of many lives even if I lived none of them. That illusion was powerful. And corrosive. I began to feel anger, sharp and unfamiliar. Not at others, but at myself for confusing caution with depth, delay with maturity. I saw how often I chose analysis over experience. How often I planned instead of acted. How often I rehearsed futures instead of stepping into one. I was living in drafts. Nothing final. Nothing committed. Nothing fully alive. That's when the exhaustion set in. Not physical exhaustion, existential. The kind that comes from carrying too many unlived lives inside you. I noticed it in my body first. Tight chest. Shallow breaths. A constant low-level tension, like I was bracing for something that never arrived. I tried to rest. Rest didn't help. Because rest assumes movement will resume. I wasn't resting. I was stuck. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself longer than usual. I didn't feel old, but I felt delayed. Like someone who arrived late to their own life and was trying to blend in. I asked myself a question I had avoided with impressive consistency: If I keep waiting, what exactly do I think will change? The answer came quickly. Nothing. Waiting wasn't creating clarity. It was eroding courage. I began to understand that readiness is not something you acquire by standing still. It's something you build by moving while uncertain. Every year I waited made the first step feel heavier, not lighter. I thought about all the versions of myself that existed only in preparation. The paths I could still imagine but no longer realistically enter. The time I had spent preserving potential instead of living reality. That's when regret finally sharpened. Not regret for wrong choices. Regret for postponed ones. I saw the pattern clearly now. I had mistaken safety for neutrality, delay for patience, and pause for control. In truth, pause had become my prison. And the door wasn't locked. I was holding it closed. That realization didn't give me energy. It gave me urgency. A quiet, unsettling urgency that didn't shout or dramatize itself. It simply refused to go away. I didn't know yet how to move. But I knew that staying paused was no longer an option. Because at some point, waiting stops being preparation. And becomes surrender. I wish I could say that the moment I decided to move, everything became clear. It didn't. Clarity is a myth we tell ourselves to justify waiting. What actually came was discomfort, raw, unfamiliar, unavoidable. The first step wasn't bold. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't look like a turning point from the outside. It was simply the moment I stopped asking myself whether I was ready. I acted while uncertain. I chose while afraid. I moved without guarantees. And that felt like betrayal of my habits, of my self-image, of the careful person I had spent years becoming. I realized how deeply I had confused control with safety. How much I believed that if I waited long enough, life would present itself fully formed, risk-free, and obvious. Life doesn't do that. It meets you halfway only after you step forward. The early days were uncomfortable in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not dramatic suffering, quiet destabilization. The loss of familiar reference points. The unsettling realization that without preparation as my identity, I didn't quite know who I was yet. That scared me. For years, I had defined myself by restraint. By caution. By the ability to hold back. Now I had to learn how to exist without constant rehearsal. I felt exposed. I made imperfect decisions. I doubted myself constantly. I questioned whether I had waited too long, whether I had already missed my chance, whether starting now was just a diluted version of what could have been. Regret surfaced, real regret this time. Not sharp, not loud. Heavy. Regret for the years I had spent preparing for a life that never began. Regret for the courage I postponed. Regret for the version of myself who believed waiting was harmless. I let myself feel it. Not to drown in it but to acknowledge it. Regret, I learned, isn't a punishment. It's information. It tells you where you stopped listening. Slowly, something shifted. Not externally, internally. Time began to feel different. Days stopped slipping past me unnoticed. Even difficult moments felt distinct, textured, real. I wasn't happier. I was present. Presence is harder than happiness. Happiness can be chased. Presence has to be tolerated. It means feeling uncertainty without immediately escaping it. It means making choices without knowing how they'll age. It means accepting that some doors will close the moment you walk through another. I began to understand why I had avoided the state for so long. Presence makes you accountable. You can no longer hide behind preparation. You can no longer blame timing. You can no longer say, I'll live later. Later doesn't exist anymore. Only now. I stopped measuring my life by potential. Stopped asking what I could have been. That question had kept me suspended for years. I started asking a different one: What am I doing with the time I still have? That question is quieter and far more demanding. Some days, I still feel fear. Some days, I still question whether I'm moving fast enough, far enough, boldly enough. But I no longer confuse hesitation with wisdom. I no longer call surrender patience. And I no longer tell myself that waiting is neutral. Because I've lived that lie. I know its cost. If you're listening to this and you feel that familiar stillness, not peace, but pause, I want you to hear this clearly: waiting is not harmless. Preparation is not progress. And safety is not the same as living. You don't need certainty to begin. You don't need confidence to move. You don't even need to know where you're going. You only need to stop pretending that staying still is protecting you. I didn't lose my life. I delayed it. And delay, unlike failure, is invisible until it isn't. Now, even when I'm afraid, even when the future feels unclear, even when regret whispers about time already lost, there is one thing I no longer doubt: I am no longer living on pause. I am moving imperfectly, uncertainly, consciously. And after years of waiting for my life to begin, that movement, however small, finally feels like living.